Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. If these reflections speak to something silent inside you, subscribe so you don't lose the path back here. Every like, every comment helps this message find those who are still searching in the dark. Now, let's begin. You want to lie down all day. Your body feels heavy, like gravity has doubled its pull on you. Your mind feels drained, foggy, disconnected. Society calls this laziness. Your family calls it depression. Self-help gurus call it a lack of discipline. But a profound school of thought reveals something that turns all of that on its head. This desire to withdraw, to rest, to lie down and do absolutely nothing. It's not weakness, it's not failure. It's your soul making a demand that the modern world refuses to understand. And ignoring it might be the most dangerous thing you can do. This perspective was built on decades of studying people who felt exactly what you're feeling right now. That overwhelming need to just stop, to disconnect, to lie horizontal and let the world spin without you for a while. What was found wasn't pathology. It wasn't mental illness. It was something far more profound and far more important. Your psyche is asking for something essential. And the exhaustion you feel, that's what happens when you keep saying no. Society has trained us to see rest as the enemy. Productivity is praised. Hustle is celebrated. The person who can push through exhaustion and keep going is held up as the ideal. But this view is not just wrong. It's psychologically dangerous. Because when your soul demands rest and you force yourself to keep moving, something inside you starts to break down. Not in the way a machine breaks down, in a way that's far more serious. Your sense of self begins to dissolve. This is known as psychological annihilation. It's what happens when you absorb too much from the outside world without giving your psyche time to process and integrate. Think about it. Every interaction you have, every emotion you witness, every piece of psychological material you encounter throughout your day, all of that gets absorbed into your unconscious. Your psyche has to sort through it. Figure out what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Integrate what's useful and release what isn't. But that work takes energy. It takes time. It takes rest. Most people don't realize how much psychological material they're processing every single day. You wake up, and immediately your psyche is absorbing emotional content, processing social dynamics, trying to figure out what response is expected of you. Then you go through your day. You interact with your family and you absorb their moods, their tensions, their unspoken resentments. You navigate complex social hierarchies at work. Read between the lines of what people mean versus what they say. Manage your own emotional responses while appearing professional. You engage with friends, attuned to their emotional states. Modulate your energy to match theirs. Every interaction requires your psyche to process information, distinguish your emotions from theirs, maintain your sense of self while remaining connected. This is exhausting work that nobody acknowledges as work. We think of work as the tasks we complete. But the real work, the psychological work, is happening beneath all of that. It's the constant processing of emotional data, the perpetual navigation of social dynamics, the continuous effort of maintaining boundaries while remaining empathic. And if you're someone with differentiated perception, someone who picks up on unconscious material that others miss completely, you're doing even more work that nobody can see or validate. When you don't give your psyche that time, when you just keep pushing and absorbing and moving, the psychological material starts to pile up. You lose the ability to distinguish between your own emotions and the emotions you've absorbed from others. You lose touch with your own thoughts because your mind is cluttered with everyone else's psychological debris. You start to feel like you're drowning in a sea of external demands, external expectations, external energy, and your psyche, in a last desperate attempt to protect you, initiates an emergency shutdown. That's what the desire to lie down actually is. It's not laziness, it's not depression, at least not in the clinical sense. It's your psyche's emergency brake. Your unconscious mind recognizing that if you keep going at this pace, if you keep absorbing without processing, you will lose yourself completely. The exhaustion you feel is actually a sophisticated protective mechanism. Your soul is trying to save you from psychological annihilation. This pattern was observed repeatedly in clinical work. It was noticed that the people who felt this overwhelming need for rest were often the most perceptive individuals. They were the ones who could read a room instantly, the ones who sensed emotional undercurrents that others missed completely, the ones who seemed to know what someone was really feeling even when that person was hiding it behind a smile. This is called differentiated perception. And it was discovered that it came with a devastating cost. These individuals weren't just more sensitive in some vague, general way. They had developed what can be described as a highly differentiated intuitive function. Their brains processed information at a different level than most people. They picked up on micro-expressions that flash across someone's face for a fraction of a second. They detected subtle shifts in vocal tone that reveal what someone is really feeling. They sensed the psychological atmosphere of a space within moments of entering it. They could feel the tension in a relationship before either person had consciously acknowledged there was a problem. This level of perception sounds like a gift, and in some ways it is. But it was also discovered to be a burden that most people couldn't understand. Empaths aren't broken. They're alchemists in progress. When you can see what others cannot see, when you perceive truths that others refuse to acknowledge, you start to live in a different reality than the people around you. You're watching a completely different movie than everyone else, but you're all supposed to pretend you're seeing the same thing. And that dissonance, that constant gap between what you perceive and what others claim to perceive is psychologically devastating. Imagine being in a family gathering where everyone is laughing and acting like everything is fine. But you can feel the rage simmering beneath your father's forced smile. You can sense the deep sadness your mother is suppressing behind her cheerful hostess routine. You can detect the resentment between siblings that nobody will name. You can perceive all of this with absolute clarity. And when you try to acknowledge it, even gently, everyone looks at you like you're crazy. They insist everything is fine. They accuse you of being negative, of creating problems, of being unable to just relax and enjoy the moment. So, you learn to stay silent. You learn to pretend you don't see what you clearly see. And that act of constant self-betrayal, that perpetual denial of your own accurate perception, it eats away at you from the inside. When you can perceive things that others cannot see, when you pick up on emotional truths that others remain blind to, you exist in a different reality than the people around you. You become what can be called an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. And that isolation is exhausting in a way that most people will never understand. You see the dysfunction in your family that everyone else pretends doesn't exist. You sense the toxicity in your workplace that everyone else has learned to ignore. You feel the collective lies that hold social groups together, the unspoken agreements to not acknowledge certain truths. And because you can see all of this, because your perception is differentiated while everyone else remains unconscious, you become a threat, not intentionally. Just by existing authentically, you threaten the collective agreements that keep everyone comfortable in their unconsciousness. This is where the concept of the scapegoat phenomenon becomes crucial. It was documented case after case of highly perceptive individuals who were systematically targeted by the groups they belonged to. Not because they were doing anything wrong, but because their clear perception reflected back the shadow that the collective was trying to ignore. The family's dysfunction, the organization's corruption, the relationship's fundamental dishonesty. The perceptive person sees it, and just by seeing it, they become dangerous to those who need to remain blind. So what does the group do? They attack the mirror. They gaslight the perceptive person, telling them they're too sensitive, too negative, too judgmental. They blame them for creating problems that were there all along. They make the perceptive individual feel crazy for seeing what is objectively real. And the perceptive person, usually being empathic and kind, internalizes this. They start to doubt their own perceptions. They exhaust themselves trying to prove they're not the problem. They absorb the projections thrown at them, taking on guilt and shame for simply seeing clearly. This scapegoating follows a predictable pattern. The perceptive person notices something wrong and gently brings it up, trying to help. But the response they get is not gratitude. It's defensiveness, denial, anger. The person or group being confronted with truth they've been avoiding doesn't want to hear it. They've invested enormous energy in not seeing this thing. So they have two choices. Integrate what they're being shown and face their shadow, or attack the messenger. And attacking the messenger is so much easier. They start to portray the perceptive person as the problem. She's always stirring up drama. He's too intense. She can't just let things be. Slowly, the group unites around this narrative. The perceptive person becomes the scapegoat, the repository for everything the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. All the dysfunction, all the shadow material that nobody wants to own, it gets projected onto the person who dared to see clearly. This is soul-crushing work, defending your reality against people who are invested in denying it. Absorbing projections from people who cannot face their own darkness. Maintaining your sanity in systems that require your silence to function. And eventually, your psyche says enough. The desire to lie down becomes overwhelming because your soul is demanding that you stop participating in this psychological warfare. Stop defending. Stop explaining. Stop absorbing. Just stop. But the nature of this exhaustion varies depending on your psychological type. Different forms of intuitive perception were identified, each with its own kind of overwhelm. If you're a feeling intuitive type, you don't just observe emotions, you absorb them into your own body. You walk into a room and feel the grief someone is suppressing, the anger someone is hiding, the fear someone won't acknowledge, and you feel it as if it's your own. You can't distinguish anymore between your authentic emotions and the emotions you've taken on from others. Your nervous system is constantly processing feelings that don't belong to you, and the exhaustion is cellular. Your body literally needs to lie down because it's carrying emotional weight that isn't yours to carry. If you're a thinking intuitive type, your exhaustion comes from pattern recognition you can't turn off. You see the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot see yet. You predict the relationship failure months before it happens. You sense the career disaster before anyone acknowledges the warning signs. You understand where current patterns will lead, and you watch helplessly as people march toward outcomes you can see clearly, but cannot convince them to avoid. The burden of knowing what's coming, of seeing the patterns while everyone else remains blind to them, creates a constant low-grade anxiety that drains your energy completely. And if you're a pure intuitive type, someone whose intuition operates without a strong auxiliary function to help organize it, you live in a state of perpetual information overload. You receive vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. The unconscious pours data into your awareness faster than you can possibly integrate it, and the only relief comes from complete withdrawal. You need to lie down not just to rest, but to make the flood of information stop long enough for you to remember who you are underneath it all. This is why the desire to lie down is not a problem to be solved. It's a message to be honored. Your soul is not broken. Your psyche is not malfunctioning. You are experiencing the necessary first stage of a profound psychological transformation. The rest you're craving is the required shutdown before what can be called the clarity event. The moment when everything shifts. Think of it like a computer that's been running too many programs for too long. It starts to glitch, it slows down, it becomes unreliable, and eventually it needs to shut down completely, clear its cache and reboot with a clean system. Your psyche works the same way. The desire to lie down is your soul initiating a reboot, clearing out all the external psychological material you've absorbed, reorganizing your internal structure, preparing you for a fundamental upgrade in how you operate in the world. But here's what most people don't understand. This rest period isn't the end of your story. It's the preparation for your awakening. It was observed that people who honored this need for withdrawal, who actually gave themselves permission to rest deeply and completely, often emerged transformed, not gradually, suddenly. This is known as shadow integration under extreme duress. It's the moment when you stop denying your own strength, when you stop apologizing for your intelligence, when you stop pretending you don't see what you clearly see, when you finally claim your right to boundaries, to sovereignty, to living in your own truth, regardless of how uncomfortable that makes other people. The perceptive person who has been absorbing everyone's emotions, defending against constant projections, doubting their own reality to keep the peace, suddenly they snap. Not into violence or cruelty, into clarity, into an unshakable knowing that they were right all along, into a fierce commitment to protecting their own psychological space, into a refusal to participate in collective delusions just to make others comfortable. And this transformation, this integration of their shadow strength with their empathic sensitivity, creates what can be called the integrated empath. Someone who can still feel deeply, but chooses strategically where that feeling flows. Someone who can still see clearly but no longer needs others to validate what they see. Someone who has love, genuine love, but with boundaries that cannot be crossed. This integrated state represents a fundamental shift in how you operate psychologically. Before integration, you were running defensive software. You were trying to prove you weren't the problem. You were attempting to make people understand. You were hoping that if you could just explain yourself clearly enough or be good enough or accommodating enough, people would finally see the truth and stop attacking you. You were operating from a place of seeking external validation for your internal knowing. After integration, that entire operating system shuts down. You're no longer trying to prove anything to anyone. You're no longer seeking validation for what you know to be true. You're no longer hoping people will change or wake up or finally get it. You've accepted that most people aren't ready to see what you see, and that's no longer your problem to solve. Your energy, which was once scattered across a dozen people's needs and projections, suddenly consolidates. It comes back to you. And with that consolidated energy comes a power you didn't know you possessed. You develop what can be called strategic empathy. You can still feel what others are feeling. You can still read the room with devastating accuracy, but now you have a choice about whether to engage with what you're perceiving. You're not automatically absorbing everyone's emotions anymore. You're not unconsciously taking on responsibility for other people's psychological states. You can perceive someone's pain and choose not to take it into your own body. You can see someone's manipulation and choose not to participate in it. You can sense dysfunction and choose not to try to fix it. This selectivity, this conscious choice about where your empathy flows, this is what makes you dangerous to unconscious systems. Because unconscious systems, whether they're families or organizations or relationships, rely on having people who will unconsciously absorb the shadow material. They need someone who will carry the anxiety so everyone else can remain calm. They need someone who will voice the concerns so everyone else can dismiss them. They need someone who will take the blame so everyone else can maintain their innocence. And when you stop playing that role, When you withdraw your unconscious participation, the system has to face what it's been avoiding. Things have to change because you're no longer willing to be the container for collective shadow. This is when the desire to lie down finally ends. Not because you forced yourself to push through it, but because you honored it completely. You gave your soul the rest it demanded. You allowed the reboot to happen, and when you emerge, you're operating on entirely different psychological software. You're no longer vulnerable to manipulation because you see it coming from miles away. You're no longer drained by other people's emotions because you've learned to distinguish yours from theirs. You're no longer exhausted by defending your reality because you no longer need external validation to trust what you know. This entire process can be framed as the beginning of individuation. The journey of becoming who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, all the absorbed psychological material, all the collective expectations, and the first stage of individuation always is withdrawal. It has to be. You cannot hear your own voice when you're surrounded by noise. You cannot distinguish your authentic self from your false self when you're constantly engaged with external demands. You cannot integrate your shadow when you're focused outward on everyone else's darkness. Solitude is not optional for this work. It's essential. The rest you're craving, the desire to lie down and disconnect from the world. That's your soul demanding the solitude necessary for differentiation, for figuring out what belongs to you and what you've absorbed from others, for reclaiming your psychological boundaries, for sorting through the accumulated material in your unconscious and releasing what isn't yours. This work cannot happen in action. It can only happen in stillness. In solitude, something remarkable starts to happen. At first, you might feel guilty for withdrawing. You might hear voices in your head telling you you're being selfish, lazy, antisocial. Those voices are the internalized judgments from a society that doesn't understand psychological work. But if you can sit with that guilt, if you can stay with the solitude despite the discomfort, those external voices start to quiet down. And underneath them, you begin to hear something else. Your own voice. Not the voice that's been conditioned by others' expectations. Not the voice that's trying to manage everyone's feelings. Your actual authentic inner voice. This voice might be quiet at first. It might be tentative. It's been drowned out for so long by external noise and internal anxiety that it's learned not to speak up. But in the solitude, in the silence, it starts to emerge, and it tells you things. It tells you what you really want, not what you think you should want. It tells you what you actually feel, not what you think you should feel. It tells you what you know to be true, even when that truth is uncomfortable or inconvenient. This is differentiation happening in real time. You're separating your authentic self from the false self you constructed to survive in unconscious systems. And once you've established what belongs to you and what belongs to others, once you've reclaimed your boundaries and your authentic self, the next stage of individuation begins. Shadow integration. This is where you turn your perception inward. Instead of constantly observing everyone else's darkness, you acknowledge your own. You recognize that you contain every human quality you observe in others. The capacity for selfishness, for cruelty, for manipulation, for destructive rage. You're not acting on these qualities, but they exist within you as potentials. And the moment you acknowledge them, own them, integrate them consciously, you become complete. Shadow integration is uncomfortable work. It requires you to admit things about yourself that you'd rather deny, that you're capable of being just as selfish as the people you've judged, that you have your own capacity for cruelty, even if you express it through cold withdrawal rather than hot rage, that you've manipulated people too. Maybe not overtly, but through playing the victim or withholding information or managing perceptions. that you contain darkness just like everyone else. The difference is you're choosing to look at it. You're choosing to own it. You're choosing to integrate it consciously instead of projecting it onto others. And here's what was discovered that most people don't understand. When you own your shadow, when you acknowledge your own darkness and integrate it consciously, you don't become more harmful. You become less harmful because you're no longer unconsciously acting out your shadow while convincing yourself you're innocent. You're no longer projecting your darkness onto others and attacking them for qualities you refuse to see in yourself. You're no longer splitting the world into good people and bad people with yourself firmly in the good category. You become whole, human, real. And from that wholeness, you can engage with others without judgment, without projection, without the constant need to prove your own goodness by highlighting someone else's badness. This is the psychological transformation that the rest period was preparing you for. Because once you own your shadow, you can see other people without judgment or projection. You're no longer triggered by their darkness because you've made peace with your own. You're no longer trying to fix them because you understand that everyone must do their own shadow work. You're no longer drained by them because you're no longer unconsciously absorbing their psychological material. You've become sovereign, psychologically independent, whole. It is believed that people who complete this process, people who honor their soul's demand for rest and emerge transformed through individuation, become what can be called consciousness pioneers. They are the individuals who evolve beyond collective limitations, who see possibilities that the masses cannot imagine yet, who carry consciousness for a culture that isn't ready to carry it itself. They become bridges between the unconscious collective and conscious development, not through preaching or teaching, but simply through being living examples of what integrated consciousness looks like. This is the evolutionary purpose of your exhaustion. Your desire to lie down isn't a personal failing. It's your psyche preparing you to serve consciousness evolution, both your own and potentially the collective's. You're not too weak to handle normal life. You're too advanced to keep participating in collective unconsciousness. Your soul is demanding that you level up, and the rest period is how that upgrade happens. But our society doesn't understand this. We've built entire systems around the denial of rest. We praise workaholism. We celebrate people who sacrifice their well-being for productivity. We've created a culture where rest is seen as laziness and withdrawal is seen as antisocial. We've made it almost impossible to honor the soul's natural rhythms of activity and rest, expansion and contraction, external engagement and internal processing. And the cost of this is epidemic-level burnout, anxiety, depression, and loss of meaning. It can be said we're experiencing collective psychological crisis precisely because we refuse to honor the wisdom of withdrawal. We've lost touch with the understanding that rest is sacred, that solitude is necessary, that the desire to stop and be still is not weakness but wisdom, that your soul knows things your conscious mind has forgotten, and when your soul demands rest, it's demanding something essential to your survival and your transformation. So here's what this wisdom would tell you if it were sitting across from you right now. The desire to lie down all day is your soul asking for something, not suggesting, not hinting, asking directly. And the question is whether you're brave enough to honor that ask, whether you're willing to disappoint people who expect you to keep performing, whether you can tolerate being called lazy by people who don't understand psychological sophistication, whether you trust your own inner knowing more than you trust social conditioning. Because here's the truth that was discovered through decades of clinical work and personal experience. The people who ignore their soul's demand for rest eventually break. Not in obvious ways, in subtle ways. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe. They lose touch with who they really are. Lose your way. They become when the next reflection arrives. They perform a life that doesn't actually belong to them. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it while experiencing internal emptiness. And share your thoughts below. They make it to the end, having never actually lived as themselves. Becomes a spark. One awakened mind helping another remember. Together, we move beyond the dark. But the people who honor the demand for rest, who give themselves permission to withdraw when their soul asks for it, who trust the wisdom of their exhaustion instead of fighting it, those people transform. They emerge from the rest period with clarity they didn't have before, with boundaries they couldn't maintain before, with sovereignty they never claimed before. They become dangerous in the best possible way, dangerous to systems that rely on unconsciousness, dangerous to people who need others to remain small, dangerous to collective delusions that require everyone's participation to survive. Your desire to lie down is not the problem. Your resistance to it is the problem. Your belief that you should be able to push through it is the problem. Your internalization of a culture that values productivity over psychological integration is the problem. The desire itself is wisdom. It's your soul protecting you from annihilation. It's your psyche initiating transformation. It's your unconscious mind preparing you for breakthrough. And the only question that matters is whether you're going to honor it or ignore it. This work gives you permission to rest, not as an escape, not as avoidance, but as a sacred psychological necessity. Your soul is asking for time to sort through everything you've absorbed, everything you've witnessed, everything you've carried. It's asking for space to integrate your shadow. It's asking for solitude to remember who you are beneath all the noise. And when you give it that time, that space, that solitude, you don't emerge weaker. You emerge as the person you were always meant to become. Conscious, integrated, sovereign, whole. So if you're feeling that pull to withdraw, if your body is heavy with exhaustion, if your soul is screaming for rest, maybe it's time to stop fighting it. Maybe it's time to trust that your psyche knows what it needs better than any external voice telling you to push through. Maybe it's time to honor the wisdom of your own soul and let yourself lie down. Not forever, just for as long as transformation requires. Because on the other side of that rest, there's a version of you waiting. A version that's stronger, clearer, more authentic, and completely immune to the unconsciousness that used to drain you. And that version of you, that's who your soul has been asking for all along. Have you felt this overwhelming need to rest and been told it's just laziness? Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes knowing you're not alone in this makes all the difference. And if you want more insights into this psychology and what it reveals about your inner world, subscribe. There's so much more to explore about the wisdom your psyche already holds. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark. One awakened mind helping another remember. Together, we move beyond the dark.